a place where the silence was not an absence of sound but a presence of something heavy and ancient. In the first week, the disturbances were so subtle that Jessica could dismiss them as the eccentricities of an old house. She would place her keys on the kitchen counter and find them 10 minutes later on the mantel in the living room. She would hear the slow, rhythmic creak of a floorboard in the hallway above her, only to find the upstairs empty and bathed in the cold, gray light of evening. But then the shadows began to change. They did not behave as shadows should. When she stood in the kitchen, the light from the single overhead bulb cast her shadow against the pantry door, but the silhouette would linger for a heart-stopping second after she moved, a dark stain that seemed to peel itself away from the wood with agonizing slowness. At the tree line, where the forest began its dense, tangled ascent into the hills, she began to see him. Or it. It was a figure that defied the eye's attempt to focus, a smudge of deeper darkness against the twilight. It did not move, but every time she blinked, it seemed to have drawn a single inch closer. This was Voreth. He was not a creature of flesh and bone, but an ancient hunger, a possessor that had haunted the ley lines of this valley since before the first stone of the chapel had been laid. Voreth did not strike quickly. He was a connoisseur of terror, feeding on the chemical spike of adrenaline and the slow erosion of the victim's sanity. He stalked his prey for days, weaving himself into the fabric of their perception until the boundary between the world and the nightmare became porous. The sleep paralysis began on the 14th night. Jessica awoke to find the air in her bedroom turned to ice. She could not move a finger, could not draw a full breath. The ceiling seemed to have descended, pressing down on her chest with the weight of a tombstone. In the corner of the room, the shadows coalesced into a tall, spindly shape that lacked a face, possessing only a void where features should be. She felt a cold, dry pressure against her ear, and a voice, if it could be called that, whispered in a language that sounded like the grinding of stones in a deep well. It was a sequence of guttural clicks and sibilant hisses that bypasses the ears and resonated directly in the marrow of her bones. When she finally broke the paralysis, screaming into the empty room, she ran to the bathroom to splash cold water on her face. As she looked into the mirror, her reflection moved a half-second too slow. The Jessica in the glass stared back with a blank, predatory intensity for a heartbeat before mimicking her movements, but the eyes remained wrong, too dark, too wide, as if something were peering out from behind her pupils. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, when the rain was a relentless gray curtain. Jessica was in the cellar, trying to relight the pilot light on the ancient furnace, when the light bulb overhead shattered. In the absolute darkness, the temperature plummeted. She felt a hand, long, multi-jointed, and freezing, wrap around her throat. It didn't squeeze, it simply held her. Then, the darkness parted, and she saw Voreth's true form. It was a shifting mass of oily blackness, 1,000 screaming faces caught in a web of smoke, and at the center, a single unblinking eye that reflected her own soul, flayed and shivering. The psychological damage was instantaneous. The sheer wrongness of the entity cracked the foundations of her identity, leaving a jagged fissure in her psyche. In that moment of pure, crystalline dread, Jessica Calloway ceased to be a whole person. She became a vessel. By the end of the first month, the Jessica the townspeople knew was gone. Her few friends back home received strange, fragmentary text messages, written in a syntax that felt alien. When the local grocer saw her for the last time, he noted that her eyes were hollow, her skin the color of damp parchment. She walked with a stiff, mechanical gait, as if her limbs were being operated by invisible wires. Then, she vanished entirely. The house was left open to the wind, the front door swinging on its hinges, and the only tracks in the mud led straight into the heart of the Black Woods. Father Dominic arrived in Blackwood Creek 3 days after the missing persons report was filed. He was 32 years old, a man of science and theology who viewed the world through the lens of rational skepticism. He had been sent by the diocese not as an exorcist, but as an observer, a recorder of facts to debunk what he assumed was a case of rural hysteria or untreated schizophrenia. He was joined by Father Cahill, a man who looked as though he had been carved from old oak and scarred by lightning. Cahill was 76 years old, and his hands shook with a tremor that only ceased when he gripped his rosary. He had faced Voreth 40 years ago, in a different valley, a battle that had left his predecessor dead, and Cahill's soul permanently singed. "You think this is a matter of the mind, Dominic," Cahill said as they drove the winding mountain roads. the heater in the car failing to ward off the unnatural chill. But Voreth does not want the mind. He wants the space where the soul sits. He consumes it in stages. First the peace, then the memory, then the will. By the time we find her, there may be nothing left of the girl but the meat. Dominic adjusted his glasses, his expression one of polite disagreement. The human psyche is capable of manifesting incredible delusions under stress, Father. Isolation does strange things to the brain. This isn't isolation, Cahill growled, his eyes fixed on the darkening woods. This is a hunt, and we are late. The investigation led them through a labyrinth of local folklore and terrifying witness accounts. They spoke to a farmer who had seen Jessica standing in the middle of a field at 4 a.m, her head tilted back at an impossible angle, screaming at the moon in a voice that sounded like a choir of crows. They found her trail in the abandoned farmhouse on the edge of the northern ridge. The air inside the house was thick with the smell of copper and rot. Flies buzzed in thick black clusters against the windows, despite the freezing cold. In the center of the kitchen, they found her. Jessica was crouched on top of the refrigerator, her fingers digging into the metal. Her hair was matted with filth, and her fingernails were broken and bleeding. For one fleeting second, the blackness in her eyes receded, and the real Jessica looked out. "Please," she wheezed, the sound tearing at her throat. "It's so cold. Make it stop." Then the light vanished from her gaze. Her jaw unhinged with a sickening pop, and a sound erupted from her lungs that no human throat could produce, a low, vibrating growl that shook the floorboards. She launched herself at them with the speed of a striking viper. Dominic was thrown backward, his head cracking against the wall, while Cahill stood his ground, brandishing a silver crucifix. The demon in Jessica's body recoiled, hissing as if the very air around the cross were caustic. They managed to retreat, bolting the door behind them as the wood began to splinter under the force of her blows. Dominic sat in the dirt outside, gasping for air, his skepticism shattered like the light bulb in Jessica's cellar. That was not a delusion," he stammered. "No," Cahill said, wiping blood from a scratch on his cheek. "That was the shadow of a god that should have stayed buried. But we found her in time. The soul is still there, pinned under the weight of him. We need to move." Now Cahill knew they couldn't perform the rite in the farmhouse. The ground was too tainted. They needed consecrated earth. On the edge of town sat an old, deconsecrated chapel, a stone structure built in the 1700s that still retained a faint, residual holiness in its foundations. Cahill had spent the last 48 hours preparing it, laying down circles of salt mixed with blessed ash and carving ancient protective sigils into the door frames. He had gathered a vial of water from a spring that had never seen the sun, and a heavy iron-bound book of rites. "We lure her there," Cahill explained, his voice grim. "Voreth is arrogant. He believes he has won. He will come for us because he wants to snuff out the light we carry. He's hungry, Dominic. He hasn't had a priest's soul in a long time." The trap was set as the moon rose, a sliver of white bone in a black sky. They waited in the chapel, the only light coming from 12 beeswax candles arranged in a circle. The silence was absolute until the heavy oak doors creaked open. Jessica walked in. She was no longer lunging or screaming. She walked with a terrifying, regal calm, her feet bare on the cold stone. Voreth did not hide. He looked out through her eyes, mocking them with a smile that stretched Jessica's lips until they bled. "The old man and the boy," the demon said, the voice echoing from every corner of the chapel simultaneously. "One smells of rot and the other of fear. Which shall I break first?" the rite began. Cahill's voice rose in a powerful rhythmic Latin, the words acting as a physical weight in the room. The air grew thick, the candlelight flickering violently as if blown by a gale. Voreth laughed, a sound like glass breaking. He began to speak, peeling back the layers of Dominic's mind. He spoke of the young priest's secret doubts, the night he had looked at the Eucharist and felt nothing but the taste of bread. He showed Dominic a vision of his own future. A long, lonely life ending in a cold hospital room, forgotten by a god who was nothing more than a fiction created to stave off the dark. Dominic's voice faltered. The walls of the chapel seemed to bleed, the stone turning into raw, pulsing meat. He saw his parents, dead and decaying, reaching out for him from the floorboards. "It's not real," Cahill shouted over the roar of the demonic wind. "Don't look at the shadows, Dominic. Look at the girl." But Dominic was breaking. The vision was too vivid, the despair too heavy. He dropped his prayer book, his hands falling to his sides. Voreth turned Jessica's head toward him, her eyes swirling with a hypnotic, oily blackness. "Join her, little priest," the demon whispered. "There is so much room in the dark." Cahill knew the rite would fail if Dominic collapsed. He did something he had sworn never to do. He stepped out of the protective circle and threw himself toward Jessica, grabbing her hands. "Voreth," he bellowed, "I am the one you want. I am the one who escaped you. Take the debt from the old man." The demon shrieked in triumph, the blackness pouring out of Jessica's mouth like ink in water, coiling around Cahill. The old priest's body contorted, his skin blistering as he acted as a lightning rod, drawing the entity's focus away from the shattered Dominic. The diversion worked. The pressure on Dominic's mind vanished, replaced by a searing white-hot clarity. He saw Cahill dying, saw the life being drained out of the man who had been his mentor. Dominic lunged for the book. He didn't just read the words, he spat them, his faith no longer a matter of academic study but a desperate, clawing survival. He called upon names that had been unspoken for 1,000 years. The air in the chapel ignited with a flash of blue light. The circles of salt glowed with a fierce, blinding intensity. "Exorcismus te, omnis immundus spiritus." Dominic's voice was a thunderclap. The demon let out a final, soul-shredding scream. The entity was wrenched from Jessica's body, a towering pillar of shadow that clawed at the air before being sucked down into the very earth, leaving the scent of ozone and burnt hair. Jessica collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. Cahill fell beside her, his chest heaving, his eyes clouded but alive. The aftermath was a hollow victory. They stayed with Jessica until the sun broke over the horizon, casting long, pale fingers of light through the chapel windows. She was alive, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm, but when she finally opened her eyes, they were vacant. The pieces of her soul that Voreth had consumed, the memories of her mother's voice, the feeling of her first kiss, the very essence of who she was, were gone. She was a house that had been lived in by a monster, and the monster had taken the furniture when it left. Weeks later, Dominic visited her in the sanitarium. He was no longer a skeptic. He carried a heavy silver cross and slept with the lights on. He found Jessica sitting by a window, staring out at the manicured lawn. She didn't recognize him. She didn't recognize anyone. "How are you today, Jessica?" he asked softly. She didn't answer. She simply continued to stare at her own reflection in the window pane. Dominic turned to leave, but he stopped at the door. He watched her for a moment longer. Jessica blinked. It was a frost creeping across the world, turning everything white and cold and silent. And in the woods of Blackwood Creek, the shadows began to stretch again, reaching out for the next soul, brave enough to wander into the dark. The click of the latch was a definitive punctuation mark, yet as Dominic walked down the long, linoleum-slick corridor of the St. Jude Institute, the silence that followed felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low-frequency thrum that vibrated in the marrow of his teeth. To any other visitor, it was the sound of a modern facility. To Dominic, it sounded like the distant, rhythmic grinding of teeth. He didn't look back at Jessica's door. He couldn't. The image of her reflection, that slight, impossible delay, was burned into his retinas like the afterimage of a flashbulb. It suggested a terrifying geometry, that the girl in the chair was merely a husk, a projection, while the thing that had inhabited her had simply stepped behind the glass, waiting in the silvered dark of the mirror world for the door to be left ajar. Outside, the New England air didn't just bite, it consumed. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the promise of a snowstorm that would bury Blackwood Creek in a shroud of white. Dominic reached his car, a modest sedan that now felt like a fragile tin box against the vast, encroaching woods, and fumbled with his keys. His breath hitched in the air, a ghost of white vapor that seemed to linger a second too long before dissipating. He climbed inside, the upholstery groaning under his weight. Before he turned the ignition, his eyes drifted, almost against his will, to the rearview mirror. He sat motionless. The car was silent save for the ticking of the cooling engine. He stared at his own eyes, bloodshot, rimmed with the gray exhaustion of a man who had seen the basement of the universe. He waited. He counted his heartbeats, thudding like a muffled drum in his ears. 1, 2, 3. He blinked. His reflection blinked back instantly. A wave of nausea-induced relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. As he shifted his gaze to the back seat, he noticed the frost beginning to bloom on the rear window. It didn't crawl in the usual fractal patterns of ice. It spread in jagged, directional lines, like a script written by a frantic hand, or like the way salt crystals align when a frequency is played through them. Dominic cranked the engine. It sputtered, a mechanical cough that sounded dangerously like a wheeze, before catching. He threw the car into reverse and peeled away from the sanitarium, the tires crunching over the salt-encrusted asphalt. He had to see Cahill. The older priest had been moved to a private rectory on the outskirts of the diocese, a place intended for reflection and recovery, which Dominic knew was ecclesiastical shorthand for a place where the broken could be hidden from the flock. The drive took him through the throat of Blackwood Creek. The trees here were ancient, their branches interlocking over the road to form a ribcage of black wood against the darkening sky. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows didn't just lengthen. They seemed to detach themselves from the trunks, pooling in the ditches like spilled ink. He reached the rectory, a Victorian pile of gray stone and rotting gingerbread trim, just as the first flakes of snow began to fall. They weren't soft, they were hard, crystalline shards that rattled against his windshield like skeletal fingernails. The interior of the rectory smelled of beeswax, damp wool, and something sharper, the metallic tang of old blood. He found Cahill in a room filled with the orange, flickering glow of a dozen oil lamps. The electricity had been cut, or perhaps Cahill simply refused to trust it. The old man was wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, sitting by a fireplace that threw more smoke than heat. His face was a map of ruin. The skin around his eyes was translucent, revealing the blue-black veins beneath, and his hands, once steady enough to hold the host without a tremor, now shook with a persistent rhythmic palsy. "You saw her," Cahill said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a dry rattle, like dead leaves skittering across a tombstone. She's not there, Father," Dominic said, taking a seat on a wooden stool that felt uncomfortably like a kneeling bench. "It's like looking into a well that's gone dry. But the reflection..." He hesitated, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. The reflection moved. It moved after she did. Cahill closed his eyes. A single tear tracked through the deep creases of his cheek. "The mirror is the first veil. Voreth didn't just want her soul, Dominic. He wanted a bridge. He used the girl to hollow out a space in this world, a pocket of vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, but the dark loves it. It rushes in to fill the void." Cahill leaned forward, the firelight catching the milky cataracts that had begun to film over his pupils. When I invited him in to save you, I felt the shape of him. He isn't a demon in the way the medievalists wrote. He isn't a goat-headed man with a pitchfork. He is a displacement. He is the cold between the stars, given a name and a hunger. Dominic felt the temperature in the room drop. It wasn't the draft from the old windows. It was a localized predatory chill that seemed to radiate from the shadows in the corners of the room. "Father, the right." It finished. We said the words. The salt glowed. "I saw him dragged down," Dominic whispered, his voice cracking. "You saw what he wanted you to see," Cahill hissed, his grip tightening on the arms of his chair. "He didn't go back down. He went inwards. He's folded himself into the architecture of our perceptions. Tell me, Dominic, since that night, have you noticed the birds?" Dominic frowned. "The birds. They've stopped singing in Blackwood," Cahill said, his eyes wide and staring at something behind Dominic. "Even the crows, they've gone silent. They know the air has changed. They know the atmosphere is being customized." Suddenly the oil lamps flickered. The flames didn't jump or sputter. They bowed, all at once, toward the center of the room, as if something massive and invisible had just exhaled. The shadows behind Cahill began to stretch, climbing the wall with an oily, fluid motion. They didn't follow the contours of the furniture. They moved independently, a silhouette of a tall, multi-jointed thing that didn't belong to any man. Dominic stood up, his hand flying to the silver cross beneath his coat. "Father, look behind you." Cahill didn't turn. He simply smiled, a horrific, tragic expression. "I don't need to look, Dominic. I can feel him. He's been standing there since I woke up this morning. He's whispering the names of everyone I've ever confessed. He's telling me their sins, and he's telling me how they taste." The shadow on the wall leaned over Cahill's shoulder. It had no face, only a void where features should be, but it produced a sound, a low, wet clicking. like a swarm of insects trapped in a throat. "Go to the cellar," Cahill commanded, his voice suddenly booming with a remnant of his old authority. In the floorboards, under the third crate of hymnals, there is a box. It's wrapped in lead and bound with the hair of a suicide. Do not open it here. Take it to the farmhouse, the one where we found her. The farmhouse? Father, that place is a charnel house. It is the anchor, Cahill barked, coughing violently, a fleck of black bile landing on his lip. The veil is thinnest there. If you want to stop the reflection from stepping out of the glass, you have to break the mirror where it was first cast. Go, before he realizes you've seen him. Dominic backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As he reached the door, he saw the shadow's long, spindly fingers, shadows of fingers, really, reach out and gently stroke Cahill's throat. The old priest shivered, but he didn't scream. He looked at Dominic with a terrifying pity. And Dominic paused, his hand on the cold iron handle of the door. Don't look in any mirrors, not even the ones in your own eyes. Dominic bolted. He ran through the dark hallways, the floorboards screaming under his boots. He reached the cellar stairs, the air down there smelling of ancient dust, and something sweet, like rotting peaches. He found the crate, his fingers bleeding as he tore at the splintered wood. He found the box. It was heavy, unnaturally so, and the lead wrapping felt oily to the touch. As he scrambled back up the stairs, he heard a sound from the room above. It was Cahill. He was laughing. But it wasn't Cahill's laugh. It was the sound of a choir of crows, a cacophony of caws and shrieks that echoed through the vents of the old house. Dominic didn't look back. He burst out into the night. The snow was a white wall now, erasing the world. He got into the car, the lead-wrapped box sitting on the passenger seat like a leaden heart. He put the car in gear, but as he turned the steering wheel, his eyes caught the side view mirror. There, standing in the snow behind the car, was Jessica. She was wearing her thin hospital gown, her feet bare in the freezing slush. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there, her head tilted at that impossible angle. But she wasn't looking at the car. She was looking at the air right next to her, whispering to someone who wasn't there. Or perhaps to someone Dominic simply couldn't see yet. He floored the accelerator, the tires spinning in the fresh snow before gripping. He surged forward, the headlights cutting weak yellow tunnels into the blizzard. He had to get to the ridge. He had to get to the farmhouse. But as he drove, he realized the heater wasn't blowing warm air anymore. It was blowing a scent, the smell of copper, rot, and the freezing, sterile wind of a place that had never known a sun. And from the passenger seat, inside the lead-wrapped box, something began to tap, 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 tap. Rhythmic, patient, a finger against the lid, asking to be let in, or out. The tapping wasn't merely a sound, it was a tactile intrusion, a vibration that traveled through the seat upholstery and into Dominic's marrow. It was syncopated, a Morse code of the damned, delivered with the heavy, wet thud of something that lacked the grace of living bone. Tap, 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 tap. Dominic's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his hands shaking so violently that the car drifted toward the edge of the road. The tires screamed as they kissed the slushy shoulder, kicking up a spray of gray sleet. He corrected the steering, his breath coming in ragged, shallow plumes that hung in the freezing air of the cabin. The heater was no longer blowing air. It was exhaling a dry, alkaline breath that tasted of crushed limestone and ancient, stagnant water. The scent of copper, bright, sharp, and metallic, thickened until he could feel it coating the back of his throat like a layer of foil. He glanced sideways at the box. The lead wrapping was dull, absorbing the weak amber light from the dashboard. The hair, the coarse black strands of the suicide, seemed to twitch. In the oscillating shadows, it looked less like a binding and more like a nest of dormant spiders, sensing the proximity of heat. The lead itself was beginning to deform. Small convex bumps appeared on the surface from the inside, as if the thing within were pressing a finger, or a tongue, against the metal, testing the strength of its cage. "Ignore it," Dominic hissed, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. "It's a trick of the mind, a displacement." But the mind was exactly what was being colonized. As he drove deeper into the throat of Blackwood Creek, the geography of the road began to shift. The trees, those ancient sentinels of rot, didn't just line the path, they seemed to lean inward. their frost-shattered branches interweaving to create a tunnel of jagged lace. The snow, which had been falling in chaotic swirls, began to take on a terrifyingly orderly motion. The flakes didn't drift. They marched. They formed geometric patterns in the air, hexagonal lattices that shimmered with a pale, bioluminescent violet. It was the customization Cahill had warned him about. The environment was being rewritten, the laws of physics being edited to accommodate a guest that did not belong to the three dimensions of man. The radio, which had been dead for miles, suddenly crackled to life. There was no music, no DJ, only the sound of a heavy, rhythmic breathing, a wet, labored inhalation that seemed to draw the very oxygen out of the car. Between the breaths, a voice emerged from the static. It wasn't a voice made of vocal cords. It was a collage of sounds. The snap of a dry twig, the hiss of a boiling kettle, the wet slap of a butcher's knife on wood. Dominic Roman, the priest, slammed his hand against the radio dial, but the knob snapped off in his fingers. The voice continued, louder now, vibrating the glass of the speedometer. The box is so heavy, Dominic. Don't you want to know why? Don't you want to see what the Father gave up to keep you in the light? Shut up, Dominic whimpered, his eyes fixed on the road, which was now a ribbon of black glass slicing through a world of shifting, impossible angles. In the name of the Father, the Son, he gave me his eyes, Dominic. He's looking through me now. He's watching you drive. He's watching the way your heart stutters. It's such a fragile little clock, isn't it? One little gear slip, and the time stops. The tapping on the box stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. It was a pressurized silence, the kind that precedes a deep-sea implosion. Dominic reached out, his hand hovering over the lead-wrapped box. He could feel the cold radiating from it. Not the cold of ice, but the cold of a vacuum. An absence of energy so profound it felt like a physical weight. Suddenly, the car's headlights swept over a figure standing in the middle of the road. Dominic slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, the tail end fishtailing wildly before the vehicle groaned to a halt, the engine stalling with a final metallic gasp. The figure stood 20 yards ahead, illuminated by the dying glow of the lamps. It was a man, tall and unnaturally thin, wearing a tattered cassock that seemed to absorb the snow rather than be covered by it. The man's head was bowed, his long pale hands tucked into his sleeves. "Father?" Dominic whispered, his hand reaching for the door handle. The man raised his head. It wasn't Cahill. The face was a smooth, featureless expanse of gray skin, like a thumbprint wiped clean. Where the eyes should have been, there were only two shallow depressions, and where the mouth should have been, there was a vertical slit, stitched shut with the same black, coarse hair that bound the box. The thing didn't walk, it displaced. One moment it was 20 yards away, the next it was 10. There was no movement in between, just a jarring skip in reality, like a scratched film reel. Dominic fumbled for the ignition. The engine groaned, a pathetic, dying sound. Come on, Skip." The thing was now 5 yards from the hood. The vertical slit in its face began to pull apart, the black hairs snapping one by one with the sound of pistol shots. A dark, viscous fluid, the color of old motor oil, began to leak from the opening. Skip. The thing was at the window, its face pressed against the glass, the gray skin deforming, flattening against the pane. It had no teeth, only rows of jagged, calcified ridges. It didn't scream, it just exhaled, and the glass began to frost over from the outside in the shape of a human hand, a hand with too many joints, reaching for the lock. Dominic grabbed the lead-wrapped box and hugged it to his chest. The lead was warm now, pulsing like a feverish brow. "Get away!" he roared, clutching the silver cross he wore around his neck until the edges bit into his palm. "By the blood of the covenant, I command you." The thing at the window paused, its head tilted at a sharp, clicking angle, 45 degrees, then 90, then a full 180, until it was staring at him upside down. The vertical slit in its face widened, and a sound came out, not a voice, but the sound of Dominic's own mother, dead 10 years, humming a lullaby he hadn't heard since he was 5. The sound broke him. A sob escaped his throat, and in that moment of weakness, the car door, locked and bolted, simply ceased to be a barrier. It didn't open. It became translucent, then smoky, then vanished altogether, leaving Dominic exposed to the biting, unnatural gale of the blizzard. The thing reached in. Its fingers were long, tapering to points that looked like charred wood. It didn't grab him, it reached for the box. No, Dominic kicked out, his boot catching the entity in what should have been its chest. His foot passed through it as if it were made of cold soot. The entity's hand closed around the box. As soon as it touched the lead, the hair bindings began to smoke. The smell of burning hair, sulphurous and cloying, filled the cabin. Dominic gripped the box with both hands, a primal, desperate strength surging through him. "This is not for you. This is the debt." The entity's faceless head leaned closer, its mouth inches from Dominic's ear. The lullaby stopped. "The debt is never paid," it whispered in Cahill's voice. "It is only refinanced." With a violent jerk, the entity pulled. Dominic was dragged halfway out of the car, his knees scraping against the jagged ice of the road. The cold was a physical assault, a million needles of frost stitching his skin to the air. Just as the box was about to be wrenched away, a flash of white light erupted from the woods to the left. It wasn't a natural light. It was a searing, magnesium-bright flare that smelled of ozone and incense. A figure emerged from the tree line, a woman, her hair a wild halo of white, wearing a heavy deerskin coat stained with dark, ritualistic symbols. She held a staff of rowan wood, the tip of which was glowing with a fierce, unstable energy. She didn't speak. She slammed the staff into the frozen ground. A shock wave of heat rippled across the road. The entity shrieked, a sound like grinding metal, and recoiled, its form flickering like a dying candle. It dissolved into a cloud of black motes that were instantly swept away by the wind. Dominic collapsed onto the slush, the lead box still clutched to his chest. He gasped for air, his lungs burning. The woman approached him, her boots crunching rhythmically on the ice. She looked down at him with eyes that were a piercing, unnatural blue, the color of a gas flame. "You're late, priest," she said, her voice like gravel in a silk bag. "The farmhouse is already beginning to breathe. If you don't get that box to the cellar within the hour, the reflection won't just be in the mirrors anymore. It'll be in the rain. It'll be in the blood in your veins." Dominic looked up at her, his vision blurring. Who are you?" "I'm the one who sold Cahill the hair you're holding," she said, reaching down to haul him to his feet. Her grip was like iron. "And I'm the only reason you're not a hollow husk on the side of this road. Now get in the car. I'll drive. You just hold onto that box and pray to whatever God you think is still listening, because the one who's answering tonight isn't the one you know." She shoved him into the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. She didn't use the key. She simply laid her hand on the dashboard, and the engine roared to life with a ferocity it had never possessed before. As they sped away, Dominic looked in the side view mirror. The entity wasn't gone. It was reforming in the middle of the road, its tall, spindly shadow stretching out toward the car like an accusing finger. And behind it, emerging from the woods, were more of them. Dozens of them, featureless, silent, and moving with that terrible, skipping gait. "Don't look back," the woman warned, her eyes fixed on the road. "The road behind us doesn't exist anymore. There's only the farmhouse now." Dominic looked down at the box. The tapping had started again. But this time it wasn't a finger. It was a voice, muffled by the lead, tiny and high-pitched like a child's. "Let me out, Dominic. It's dark in here, and I've found something. I found the Father's eyes. They're so pretty. Do you want to see?" Dominic squeezed his eyes shut and began to recite the litany of the saints, his voice a trembling whisper against the encroaching dark. The car tore through the blizzard, the headlights cutting through a world that was becoming increasingly unrecognizable, a landscape of shattered glass and frozen screams, all leading toward the farmhouse that sat like a rotting tooth in the jaw of the hills. The customization was almost complete. The atmosphere was no longer air, it was an invitation, and something very large and very hungry was finally coming home. The car didn't so much travel across the pavement as it tore through the fabric of the night. Outside the windows, the blizzard had transitioned from a storm of ice into a storm of static. Great jagged flakes of gray matter, like the charred remains of a burnt library, swirled in the headlights, sticking to the windshield in patterns that resembled cuneiform script. The woman drove with a terrifying singular focus. Her hands, gnarled and stained with the dark pigment of ritual oils, didn't just hold the steering wheel, they seemed to be part of it. Every time she shifted gears, the car let out a sound like a beast being spurred, a guttural, organic throb that vibrated through Dominic's very marrow. "The litany won't save you here, little priest," she spat, her eyes never leaving the kaleidoscopic nightmare of the road. "The saints are deaf in this zip code. They don't like the smell of what's coming." Dominic's throat was a desert. He clutched the box, and the heat from it was now so intense it was beginning to blister the skin of his forearms through his woolen coat. But he couldn't let go. The weight of it had changed. It felt heavier, denser, as if the small space inside was expanding to hold something the size of a mountain. "Dominic," the child's voice inside the box whispered again. It was clearer now, the muffled quality of the lead shielding failing to contain the sound. "I found a secret in the father's pocket. It's a key made of bone. Do you want to see what it unlocks? It unlocks the basement where the shadows go to hide from the sun." "Be silent," Dominic hissed, his knuckles white. "Don't talk to it," the woman commanded. "Every word you give it is a stitch in your own shroud. It feeds on the vibration of your voice. It's mapping your throat, Dominic. It's learning how to wear your tongue." The road ahead suddenly buckled. The asphalt rose up like a wave, and the car crested it, the suspension screaming in protest. As they descended the other side, the headlights caught the silhouette of the farmhouse. It sat atop a low, treeless hill, silhouetted against a sky the color of a fresh bruise. It wasn't just a building, it was a wound in the landscape. The wood was black, not from paint, but from rot and the slow, agonizing carbonization of something that had been burning from the inside for decades. The windows were uneven, like mismatched eyes, and from the chimney rose a thick, oily smoke that didn't drift with the wind but coiled downward, hugging the roof like a shroud. As they drew closer, Dominic realized the woman was right. The house was breathing. The walls rhythmically expanded and contracted, a slow, wet movement that sent ripples through the shingles. With every exhale, a low-frequency hum vibrated the car's glass, a sound that felt like it was trying to dismantle Dominic's atoms. "We're here," the woman said. She didn't slow down, she accelerated. "When I hit the brakes, you run. Don't look at the porch, don't look at the well, and for the love of whatever you still hold holy, do not look in the mirrors." The car skidded into the yard, the tires churning up a mixture of snow and a black, viscous mud that smelled of copper and old bile. The woman slammed the car into park, and the engine died with a sound like a heart stopping. The silence was instantaneous and deafening. "Go!" she shouted, shoving him toward the passenger door. Dominic stumbled out. The air outside was thick, pressurized, and tasted of ozone and wet feathers. He hugged the lead box to his chest, his boots sinking into the yielding, spongy earth. The ground felt less like soil and more like muscle, soft, warm, and pulsing. He ran toward the porch. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the well in the center of the yard. The stone rim was draped in long, wet tresses of black hair, the same hair that bound the box. It was overflowing, a slow tide of the dark fluid spilling over the side, carving deep, steaming trenches in the snow. Skip. Suddenly, he was at the base of the porch steps. The wood was slick with a translucent slime. He glanced back. A fatal mistake. The woman was still in the car, but she wasn't moving. She sat perfectly still, her hands still on the wheel, and behind the car, the dozens of featureless figures had reached the edge of the yard. They didn't cross the property line. They simply stood there, a silent gray audience, their heads all tilted at that same impossible, clicking angle. "Elara!" Dominic yelled, the name coming to him from a place of sudden, instinctive recognition. "Come on!" The woman turned her head. Her face was pale, her gas flame eyes wide with a terrible realization. "I can't, Dominic." The reflection, it got to the glass first. Dominic looked at the car's windshield. In the reflection, the woman wasn't sitting in the car. She was standing in the middle of the yard, her skin being peeled back by invisible hands, her body being unmade into a pillar of salt and ash. As he watched, the real woman in the driver's seat began to crack. Her skin didn't tear. It splintered like dry porcelain. A single crystalline tear rolled down her cheek before her entire head slid off her shoulders, shattering into 1,000 gray shards on the upholstery. A sob of pure, unadulterated terror broke from Dominic's throat. He turned and scrambled up the porch steps. The front door of the farmhouse was already open. It didn't lead into a hallway. It led into a throat. The walls of the foyer were lined with a wet pinkish membrane that glistened in the ambient, sourceless light. The floorboards were gone, replaced by a walkway of rib-like rafters that spanned a dark, churning abyss. "In here, Dominic," the voice in the box chirped, now sounding disturbingly like Dominic's own voice as a child. "The cellar is just down the gullet. Don't be afraid of the teeth. They only bite the things that still have hope." Dominic stepped onto the first rib. It groaned, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the entire house. The breathing of the walls intensified, the membrane bulging inward, pressing against his shoulders. It was warm, feverishly warm, and it smelled of a hospital ward where the patients had been left to rot. He made his way across the rib walk, his balance precarious. Below him, in the dark, things were moving. He heard the wet slap of appendages against stone, the sound of something very large turning over in its sleep. He reached the far side of the foyer, where a door of heavy rusted iron stood slightly ajar. Above it, carved into the fleshy lintel, were words in a language that hurt his eyes to look at. A series of jagged, interlocking runes that seemed to squirm and rearrange themselves as he watched. The customization is the revelation. Dominic pushed the iron door open. It didn't creak. It sighed. Beyond lay the stairs to the cellar. They weren't made of wood or stone. They were made of teeth, thousands of them, molars and incisors and canines, all fused together into a jagged spiral descent. He began to climb down, his boots crunching on the enamel. Each step sent a jolt of phantom pain through his own jaw. The cellar was a cavernous space, far larger than the house above it should have allowed. The walls here were not membrane, but solid, unyielding lead, etched from floor to ceiling with the same black hair that bound his box. In the center of the room stood an altar, a simple slab of gray slate, upon which sat a single silver bowl. And standing behind the altar was Father Cahill. But it wasn't the Cahill Dominic remembered. This man was a hollowed-out husk. His skin was translucent, stretched so tight over his bones that it looked like it might snap. His eyes were gone, replaced by two perfectly round, polished black stones. "You're late, Dominic," Cahill said. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It vibrated out of his chest, a hollow, rattling sound. "The Father has been waiting. The debt is due, and the currency is finally here." Cahill gestured to the bowl. "Place the box inside. Let the hair drink. Let the reflection become the reality." Dominic approached the altar, his legs shaking so violently he could barely stand. The box in his hands was now vibrating with such force it was humming, a high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge. "What's in the box, Father?" Dominic whispered. "What did you make me carry?" Cahill smiled, a slow, agonizing movement that tore the corners of his mouth. "It's not what's in the box, Dominic. It's what's not in the box. It's the piece of the world that was missing, the part that makes the nightmare make sense." Dominic looked down at the lead-wrapped package. The hair bindings were beginning to uncoil on their own, writhing like dying snakes. The lead itself was softening, turning into a thick, gray liquid that dripped onto the floor. Suddenly, the child's voice inside the box stopped. There was a moment of absolute, terrifying stillness. Then, the box opened. It didn't unfold. It blossomed. The lead and hair and wood peeled back like the petals of a black rose, revealing the contents. Dominic's breath hitched. There was no monster inside. There was no demon. There was only a mirror. A small, circular hand mirror, its glass dark and swirling with a thick, gray fog. "Look into it, Dominic," Cahill urged, his voice a seductive rasp. "See the version of yourself that the world forgot to build. See the customization." Dominic tried to look away, but his eyes were drawn to the glass by a force as inexorable as gravity. He leaned in, his face inches from the swirling fog. The fog cleared. He didn't see his reflection. He saw a room. A small, cramped room with no windows and a single, heavy door. In the center of the room sat a man, huddled in a corner, his hands over his ears. The man was screaming, but no sound came out. The man was him, but the room wasn't in the mirror. The room was the cellar. Dominic looked up, and the world shifted. The lead walls, the altar, Father Cahill, they all began to dissolve into gray motes of dust. The farmhouse, the blizzard, the woman with the gas-blue eyes, they were all being sucked into the mirror. A reverse birth that left Dominic standing in a void of absolute nothingness, except for the box. The box was still there, but it wasn't a box anymore. It was a doorway. And from the other side of the doorway, something began to crawl through. It started with a hand. A long, pale hand with too many joints, the fingers tapering to charred points. Then came the head, a smooth, featureless expanse of gray skin with a vertical slit stitched shut with black hair. Dominic tried to scream, but his voice was gone. He was the man in the mirror now, the one who had been forgotten. The entity pulled itself into the void, its form flickering and skipping through the air. It reached out and touched Dominic's face. Its fingers were cold, the cold of a vacuum, an absence of energy so profound it felt like a physical weight. "The debt is paid," the entity whispered, and this time the voice was Dominic's own, perfectly clear, perfectly sane. "The reflection is home." The entity's vertical slit began to tear open. The black hairs snapped one by one. Behind them there was no mouth. There was only a window, and through that window Dominic saw the farmhouse. He saw the road. He saw himself, driving a car through a blizzard, clutching a lead-wrapped box to his chest. He realized then that he wasn't the one in the car. He was the one waiting at the end of the road. He was the nightmare that was being customized. The entity leaned in, its faceless head pressing against Dominic's. The world began to frost over from the inside out. "Welcome home," the entity whispered. And then the clicking started. Deep within the walls of the void, the sound of a million gears began to turn. The fragile little clock of reality was being rewound, the gears slipping and grinding as they forced the world into a new shape. Dominic felt himself being pulled apart, his memories being unspooled and rewoven into the fabric of the farmhouse. He was the wood, he was the rot, he was the hum in the glass, but he was still conscious. He was still there, a trapped spark in the center of the dark. He looked through the entity's mouth and saw the car approaching the hill. He saw the version of himself, the one who still thought he was a man, a priest, a victim, clambering out of the car. He wanted to warn him. He wanted to tell him to run, to let the box go, to drown himself in the well. But all he could do was breathe. The farmhouse exhaled, a low, wet sound that vibrated through the yard. The Dominic on the porch paused, his head tilting at a sharp, clicking angle. 45 degrees, 90, 180. The customization was complete, and the hunger was only just beginning. The consciousness that had once been Dominic, the priest, the son, the man with the leaden burden, did not simply vanish. It was redistributed. It was a harrowing, microscopic expansion. His identity stretched thin across the joists and rafters until he could feel the cold wind scouring the shingles of his own scalp. He was no longer a tenant of his body. He was the landlord of a nightmare, and every nail driven into the farmhouse's frame was a needle pressed into a nerve. The clicking grew louder, a rhythmic, mechanical mastication that seemed to be coming from the very earth beneath the cellar. It was the sound of the great customizer's teeth, grinding the raw material of the universe into something more, bespoke. Below, in the hollow of his own stomach, which was also the lead-lined cellar, the husk of Father Cahill began to move. The two polished black stones that served as his eyes didn't reflect the light. They ate it. Cahill reached out with fingers that had grown long and translucent like wax tapers, his touch trailing across the silver bowl where the mirror still pulsed with a sickly gray luminescence. "Listen to the architecture, Dominic," Cahill's voice rattled, vibrating through the floorboards that were now Dominic's ribs. "Do you hear the settling? That isn't the wood cooling. That's the digestion of your soul. It's a beautiful fit, isn't it? No gaps, no leaks. Just a perfect, airtight agony." Dominic tried to scream, but the sound manifested only as a sudden, violent rattling of the window panes in the upstairs bedrooms. The glass didn't just shake, it wept. A thick, viscous frost began to crawl across the panes, forming patterns that looked like frantic, microscopic hands clawing at the air. Outside, the new Dominic, the one who had just stepped onto the porch, frozen in that impossible 180-degree posture, began to twitch. The sound of his neck snapping back into place was like dry kindling being broken over a knee. He didn't cry out. He simply exhaled a cloud of gray vapor that smelled of old incense and copper. The entity that had crawled through the mirror doorway, the one with the window mouth, began to merge with the house. It didn't walk, it flowed, its gray, multi-jointed limbs sinking into the floorboards, its featureless head becoming the center of the foyer's ceiling. The black hairs that had bound the box now dangled from the crown molding like weeping willow branches, each one tipped with a tiny calcified hook. Dominic the house felt a surge of nauseating heat. It was the customization taking root. He felt the memories of his mother's funeral being pulled from his mind and used to insulate the attic. He felt his first confession being ground down into the mortar between the bricks of the chimney. Everything he was, everything he had ever been, was being repurposed as structural support for this impossible space. "The father is hungry, Dominic," Cahill whispered, his voice now echoing from every corner of the house simultaneously. "And a house is not a home until it has been fed." The Dominic on the porch moved. His movements were no longer human. They were the movements of a marionette whose strings were being pulled by a drunkard. He stepped over the threshold, his boots thumping on the rib walk with a sound that made Dominic's internal organs spasm. As the new Dominic entered the throat of the foyer, the membrane walls began to salivate. A clear, acidic fluid dripped from the ceiling, sizzling as it hit the floorboards. The smell was overwhelming now, the sharp, ozone sting of a lightning strike mixed with the cloying sweetness of gangrene. "Look at him," the entity's voice, Dominic's voice, boomed through the rafters. "Look at the vessel. He carries the box, but he doesn't know the box is empty. He doesn't know he's bringing the void to the void." Dominic the house looked down through the eyes of the entity dangled from the ceiling. He saw himself, the pale, trembling priest, clutching the lead-wrapped package. He saw the terror in the man's eyes, a mirror of the terror he had felt only minutes, or was it centuries, ago. The new Dominic paused at the edge of the ribwalk. He looked down into the churning abyss below, where the things were moving. From this vantage point, Dominic, the house could see what those things were. They weren't monsters. They were discarded versions of himself. Failed customizations. Half-formed Dominics with too many limbs, or no faces, or skin made of rusted iron, all of them treading water in a sea of black bile, waiting for a piece of reality to fall so they could tear it apart. Why? Dominic's consciousness groaned, the sound manifesting as a low, mournful howl of wind in the chimney. "Because the world is a mistake, Dominic," Cahill replied, kneeling by the altar in the cellar, his black stone eyes fixed upward. "It's a rough draft, coarse, unrefined. The father doesn't want a world. He wants a masterpiece. He wants a nightmare so perfectly tailored to the dreamer that they can never wake up. You are the fabric. You are the thread. And now, you are the needle." The new Dominic took a step onto the first rib. Crunch. Dominic, the house felt his own sternum crack. A blinding white pain flared through his consciousness, followed by a terrifying cold numbness. The new Dominic took another step. Snap. A joist in the kitchen gave way, the floor sagging inward like a punctured lung. With every step the visitor took, the house, the real Dominic, was being broken and reset. The clicking of the gears intensified, a cacophony of grinding metal that seemed to be stripping the very skin off his thoughts. Suddenly, the new Dominic stopped. He looked up, his eyes locking onto the featureless head of the entity hanging from the ceiling. For a heartbeat, there was a connection, a horrific bridge of recognition between the victim and the trap. The new Dominic opened his mouth to scream, but instead of a voice, a swarm of black moths erupted from his throat. They were made of ash and burnt hair, their wings beating with a dry, papery sound that filled the foyer. They swirled around the entity, obscuring its window mouth, their tiny, needle-like legs pricking at the membrane walls. "The ritual is deviating," Cahill's voice hissed, a note of genuine alarm finally breaking through his hollow tone. "The reflection is resisting. Dominic, hold the frame. Do not let the walls buckle." But Dominic, the house didn't want to hold the frame. He wanted to collapse. He wanted to fold inward until he was nothing but a splinter in the eye of God. He channeled all his remaining will into the foundation, trying to force the stones to crumble, trying to make the ribwalk snap, and drop the new version of himself into the abyss. The house groaned, a sound of tectonic agony. The walls bulged outward, the pinkish membrane stretching until it was translucent, revealing the dark, pulsing veins beneath. The floorboards shrieked as the nails began to pull themselves out, turning into jagged metallic insects that scurried toward the new Dominic. "The customization cannot be undone," the entity screamed, its window mouth flickering with images of the blizzard, the car, the woman in the porcelain skin. "The debt is written in the marrow. The debt is the marrow." The new Dominic dropped the box. It didn't hit the ribwalk. It hovered in the air, the lead wrapping melting away in a stream of liquid silver, the hair bindings uncoiled, lashing out like whips, striking the membrane walls and leaving charred, smoking welts. Inside the box, the mirror didn't just show a room anymore. It showed a hole, a perfect, circular void that began to pull at the very air of the farmhouse. The moths were sucked into it first, their ash wings disintegrating into gray dust, then the acidic saliva from the ceiling, then the light. "No!" Cahill shrieked, his waxen hands clawing at the altar. "The revelation is not yet complete. The father has not finished the stitching." The suction from the mirror void was immense. Dominic the house felt his consciousness being dragged toward that central point of nothingness. He felt the shingles being ripped from his scalp, the floorboards being torn from his ribs. But as the house began to disintegrate, something else began to emerge from the shadows of the cellar. It wasn't Cahill, and it wasn't the entity. It was the shape of the hunger itself. From the dark corners of the lead-lined room, a series of long, spindly legs, thin as needles and black as oil, began to unfold. They were followed by a body that was nothing more than a collection of gears and wet, pulsing organs, all encased in a shell of translucent bone. The great customizer. It didn't have a face. It had a loom. Where its head should have been, 1,000 silver needles were moving with impossible speed, weaving the gray fog of the void into a new, even more terrifying shape. The customizer stepped toward the altar, its many legs clicking on the tooth stairs. It ignored Cahill, who had collapsed into a pile of dry bones and tattered cloth. It ignored the entity in the foyer. It reached out with a limb that ended in a delicate surgical pincer and grasped the hovering mirror. The void inside the mirror hummed. The customizer turned the mirror toward the new Dominic, who was frozen in terror on the shaking ribwalk. The first draft was flawed, a voice whispered, not Cahill's, not Dominic's, but a voice that sounded like the grinding of stars. Too much hope, too much memory. We must prune the soul to make room for the design. The customizer squeezed the mirror. The glass didn't break. It folded. And as it folded, Dominic, the house felt a new kind of pain, a pain that wasn't physical or mental, but ontological. He was being rewritten. The Dominic who was the house and the Dominic who was the visitor were being merged into a single agonizing point of data. The farmhouse didn't just collapse. It inverted. The roof pulled through the floor, the walls turned inside out, and the abyss below rose up to swallow the sky. When the clicking finally stopped, there was no farmhouse. There was no blizzard. There was only a vast, infinite plain of gray slate under a sky of roiling black hair. And in the center of the plain stood a single towering structure. It was a cathedral made of teeth and lead, its spires reaching up like reaching fingers. Inside the cathedral, at the very top of the highest spire, sat a man in a priest's collar. He was sewn into a chair made of his own memories. His eyes were gone, replaced by two perfectly round, polished black stones. He picked up a small circular hand mirror and looked into it. He didn't see a room, he didn't see a void. He saw a road, a car, a man clutching a lead-wrapped box. The man in the chair smiled, the corners of his mouth tearing with a wet, familiar sound. "Welcome home," he whispered. But downstairs, in the nave of the Tooth Cathedral, the front door, a door of heavy rusted iron, began to sigh. The customization was not a destination. It was a process. And the father was still hungry. The iron door did not merely swing open. It unsealed like a scab being picked from a divine wound. Dominic, perched atop his throne of calcified memories, felt the vibration of the hinges in the marrow of his own phantom legs. He was no longer a man in any sense that the word could hold. He was the nervous system of this cathedral. His consciousness stretched thin across rafters of interlocking jawbones and tapestries, woven from the very hair that churned in the sky above. The air in the nave below was thick with the scent of newness, a nauseatingly sterile aroma of unworked clay and fresh, unbruised spirit. It was the scent of the next draft. The visitors stepped onto the floor of the cathedral, and Dominic the cathedral felt the weight of those boots like a migraine behind his stone-blind eyes. Every footfall was a dull thud against the roof of his mouth. The visitor was small, a speck of shivering meat against the towering architecture of Dominic's own transmuted soul. This version of Dominic, call him the fourth draft, was different. His priest's collar was not white linen, but a band of raw, weeping skin. He didn't carry a lead-wrapped box. Instead, he dragged a heavy silver-linked chain, and at the end of that chain was a child. The child was a blur of unfinished features, a smudge of charcoal and tears that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "Help us," the fourth draft whispered, his voice echoing up through the throat of the spire, rattling the black stone eyes in Dominic's head. The road turned into a mouth. Please, Father, we were just trying to get to the hospital. Dominic the cathedral tried to scream, to warn the man that there was no hospital, that the father was a weaver of nightmares and the hospital was merely the operating table where reality was stripped of its skin. But his mouth was a vaulted ceiling, and his tongue was a carpet of red velvet that had long since forgotten how to form words. All he could produce was a low, resonant hum, the sound of 1,000 bees trapped in a bell jar. From the shadows behind the high altar, the great customizer emerged. Its many legs, those surgical oil-black needles, clicked in a frantic, rhythmic percussion. It did not approach the man or the child directly. Instead, it began to pace the perimeter of the nave, its loom head spinning with a blurred silver velocity. As it moved, it trailed threads of translucent silk that hummed with the sound of forgotten lullabies. A variation, the voice of the stars ground out, vibrating through the cathedral's rib vaulting. The introduction of the inheritor, a masterstroke. The guilt of the father is the strongest thread we have. It holds the tension of the weave like nothing else. The customizer paused, its pincer limb twitching toward the fourth draft. But the architecture is too rigid, it whispered, the needles on its head suddenly slowing. The cathedral is a monument to the past. We need a landscape. We need a geography of regret. Dominic the cathedral felt a cold, oily dread slide down his walls. He felt the customizer's gaze, if such a creature could be said to have a gaze, turn upward toward the spire where his self was sewn into the chair. Suddenly, the customizer lunged. It didn't climb the stairs, it ignored gravity entirely, its needle legs piercing the enamel-slick walls, hauling its clockwork and organ body up the vertical incline with terrifying speed. It reached the top of the spire in a heartbeat. The pincer limb rose, the silver needles at its tip glinting with a light that didn't come from the sky. You have served well as the frame, Dominic, the customizer hissed, its loom head hovering inches from Dominic's face. But the father finds the teeth too loud. He wants the silence of the soil. The pincer limb didn't strike, it inserted. Dominic felt the cold metal slide into his ear, through the drum, and deep into the soft, wet core of his remaining humanity. There was no pain, only a sudden, catastrophic expansion of his senses. He was no longer just the cathedral. He was the gray slate plain outside. He felt his consciousness being pulled out of the spire and poured into the ground. He felt the slate cracking, turning into something softer, darker, a rich, loamy earth that smelled of ancient burials and wet cedar. The cathedral began to sink. Downstairs, the fourth draft screamed as the floor of the nave turned into a quagmire of black mud. The rib vaulting overhead began to soften, the white enamel of the teeth melting into the gray, weeping bark of a forest that was growing downward from the ceiling. The spires didn't fall. They unrolled. They became the trunks of massive leafless trees whose branches were made of the same lead that had once wrapped the mirror box. Dominic the cathedral was being terraformed. The great customizer stood in the center of the transformation, its needles dancing, weaving the sinking stones of the cathedral into the roots of this new, impossible woods. It pulled the fourth draft's chain, reeling the man and the flickering child into the center of the dark grove. "The forest of the unborn," the customizer proclaimed, its voice now sounding like the rustle of dead leaves. "A much better setting for the next act. Here the shadows have weight. Here the echoes have teeth." Dominic, now the very ground beneath their feet, felt the fourth draft's knees hit the mud. He felt the man's despair soaking into him like acidic rain. He felt the child's flickering presence, a glitch in the customization, as a sharp, stinging itch in his subsoil. But there was something else. Deep beneath the loam of his new form, in the dark places where the customizer's needles hadn't yet reached, Dominic found a remnant of the house. A pocket of the foyer that hadn't quite dissolved. In that pocket, the mirror lay face down in the dirt. It was no longer a void. It was no longer a tool of the customizer. It was a leak. A thin trickle of something real was seeping out from under the glass. A drop of ordinary, uncustomized melted snow. It was a fragment of the blizzard, a piece of the world that was coarse and unrefined. And it was cold. A natural, honest cold that didn't care about the father's design. The customizer froze. Its loom head tilted, the needles twitching in a sudden, jagged discordance. "A contamination," it whispered, the sound like a grinding of gears. "The stitch is slipping." It turned its surgical gaze toward the spot where the mirror lay buried in Dominic's new earthen flesh. It began to dig, its needle legs tearing into the mud with a frantic, rhythmic violence. Every puncture was a stab into Dominic's mind. He felt the creature's rage, a cold mechanical fury that he was not holding the frame correctly. "The debt is the marrow," the customizer shrieked, its voice losing its melodic hum and becoming a jagged metallic screech. "You will be the forest, you will be the path, you will be the wolf and the trap." But as the customizer dug, the leak grew. The smell of the blizzard, the sharp, clean scent of freezing air, began to overwhelm the cloying sweetness of the customization. The black mud around the buried mirror began to freeze, turning into a jagged crystalline ice that resisted the creature's needles. Dominic the Forest felt a surge of something he hadn't felt since the car went off the road. Resistance. He didn't want to be the woods. He didn't want to be the cathedral. He didn't want to be the needle or the thread. He wanted to be the break. He focused all his consciousness, all the sprawling, agonizing weight of the lead trees and the loamy earth, into that single point of ice. He felt the ice spreading, a white frost creeping up the trunks of the trees, turning the lead branches into brittle glass. The fourth draft looked up, his eyes widening as the flickering child beside him suddenly solidified, the boy's hand turning cold and real in his own. "Run." "Dominic." The forest tried to say, the word manifesting as a sudden sharp crack of a freezing branch. The customizer let out a sound that was not a voice at all, but the scream of a machine being fed a handful of sand. It lunged for the mirror, its pincers snapping, but the ice was too thick, too pure. The mirror shattered, but it didn't break into pieces of glass. It broke into pieces of time. Suddenly the forest was gone. The cathedral was gone. Dominic was back in the car. The steering wheel was cold in his hands. The smell of the air freshener, stale pine, was the most beautiful thing he had ever inhaled. The blizzard was howling outside, a white wall of chaos that felt infinitely safer than the silence of the customizer. Beside him, Sarah was asleep, her head leaning against the window. His heart hammered against his ribs, his real ribs made of bone and meat, not floorboards or teeth. "It was a dream," he gasped, his breath hitching. "Just a customization of the mind." He looked into the rearview mirror. He didn't see the road behind him. He saw Cahill. Cahill was sitting in the back seat, his black stone eyes fixed on the back of Dominic's head. His waxen hands were folded neatly in his lap, and on his knees sat the lead-wrapped box. "The first draft is always the hardest to discard," Dominic, Cahill whispered, his voice as dry as a dead leaf. "You think you've escaped the design. But you forget." Cahill reached forward and touched the back of Dominic's neck with a finger that felt like a cold metal needle. "The car is the house is the cathedral is the forest." Dominic looked down at his hands on the steering wheel. The skin was beginning to turn into a fine white porcelain, and where his fingernails should have been, small silver needles were beginning to emerge, stitching his flesh to the leather of the wheel. "The father is still hungry," Cahill said, smiling a smile that tore the corners of his mouth. "And we have so many more versions of you to try." The car didn't hit a tree. It didn't slide into a ditch. The road simply began to fold. The asphalt rose up like a giant black tongue, licking the car into the air. The sky of black hair descended, the strands tangling in the tires, pulling the vehicle upward into the churning dark. Dominic tried to scream for Sarah, but when he turned to look at her, she wasn't there. In her seat sat the great customizer, its loom head already spinning, weaving her memory into a new, more terrifying shape, a bridge of sighs that would lead them to the next draft. "Welcome back," the customizer whispered, its needles clicking against the glass of the dashboard. "Let's talk about the upholstery. We were thinking something made of your childhood fears, something with a bit more texture." The car vanished into the throat of the sky, leaving nothing behind but the sound of clicking gears and the faint, lingering scent of ozone and gangrene. The customization had only just begun.
Welcome to Ripper's Nighttime Tales, a chilling series of bedtime horror stories narrated by the horror streamer Mr. Rippers with soft rain and thunder. Drift off to multiple scary tales perfect for late night listening on rumble.com. Do hit that like button and consider following the channel. Leave a comment letting me know where and when you listen. Let's build a community. Okay, let's get started.
Project Stillwater, a Ripper's Nighttime Tales presentation. Chapter 1. The first night. There is a place between sleeping and waking that scientists call the hypnagogic state, a threshold, A doorway your mind passes through twice every night without you ever noticing. For most people, it lasts only seconds. For the 6 volunteers of Project Stillwater, it lasted forever. The facility had no official address. If you searched government records, and several journalists did, eventually you would find only a reference number, a budget line buried inside a defense appropriations bill from 1994, and 3 words that told you nothing and everything at the same time. Sleep, continuity, study. The building itself sat beneath 40 feet of reinforced concrete in the hills outside of Roanoke, Virginia. No windows, no cell signal. Climate controlled to a permanent 62 degrees, because the researchers had found that participants entered REM sleep faster in the cold. They called it Project Stillwater. The name was chosen deliberately. Calming, neutral, the kind of name that appeared on a consent form and didn't raise questions. Dr. Elaine Voss had chosen it herself, back in 1992, when the program was still just a theory, a series of equations on a whiteboard in a university lab, and a grant proposal that had been rejected 4 times before someone at the Department of Defense finally picked up the phone. She had been proud of that name once. By the end, she couldn't hear it without flinching. The 6 volunteers arrived on a Monday in late October. They came separately, as instructed. They were asked not to speak to one another during intake, a precaution, they were told, to prevent bias in the baseline dream reports. Each one had been screened extensively. Psychological evaluations, sleep studies, background checks. They were selected not for their similarities, but for the precise, almost mathematical way their differences complemented each other. Dr. Voss had a term for it. She called it resonance compatibility. She never explained what that meant to the volunteers. She never explained a great many things. The first was Marcus Hale, 34 years old. Former Army Ranger, 2 tours in Afghanistan, honorably discharged in 2009. He had applied for the study through a Veterans Outreach program, drawn in by the $1,500 weekly stipend, and the assurance that participation required nothing more strenuous than sleep. What the intake forms had flagged, and what Dr. Voss had found most interesting, was the intensity of his dream activity. His REM cycles were longer than average. His dreams were vivid, structured, almost architectural in their detail, and they were almost always the same. A road, a valley, a sound like breathing in the dark. He had never told anyone about the dreams. He had never told anyone that they didn't frighten him the way they should. He told himself that was because he was disciplined. He was wrong. The second was June Calloway, 26 years old, a graduate student in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Virginia, 1 semester away from finishing her dissertation. She had found the study posting on a department bulletin board, tucked between a flyer for a roommate wanted and a notice about a campus blood drive. The stipend would cover her rent through the end of the academic year. She had signed up the same day she found it. June was practical, skeptical. She believed in measurable things, in data, in methodology, in peer review. She had chosen neuroscience specifically because the brain, however complex, was ultimately a physical object. Electrochemical signals, synaptic pathways, it could be studied, understood, mapped. She would spend a great deal of time in the weeks that followed trying to hold on to that belief. She would not entirely succeed. The others came after. Harlan Webb, a 41-year-old accountant from Richmond who had answered the ad for the money and stayed because the facility had better coffee than his office. Diane Cho, a retired school teacher with a lifelong history of sleep paralysis, who hoped the study might finally give her some answers. Paul Engstrom, a soft-spoken librarian who had not dreamed at all, not once in over 6 years, and who had begun to find the silence inside his sleep more frightening than any nightmare. And finally Thomas Reyes, who was not, despite the name badge that said otherwise, a volunteer at all. Thomas Reyes was there to watch, but that comes later. The rooms were identical. That was the first thing each of them noticed, separately, without being prompted. 6 rooms arranged along a single corridor, each one a precise mirror of the last. A bed with white linens pulled tight as a drum. A small writing desk with a notepad and a black pen. A lamp with a warm amber bulb that dimmed on a timer at 10 o'clock. A camera mounted in the upper right corner of the ceiling, its red indicator light burning steadily in the dark. No clocks. They had been told this was intentional. External time cues, Dr. Voss explained during orientation, interfered with the body's natural sleep architecture. They would be woken each morning at the same time. They would eat at structured intervals. Time, for the duration of the study, would be managed for them. Harlan Webb had not liked hearing that. He had a Casio watch he'd owned since 1987, and he wore it everywhere, including the shower. The intake staff had asked him to leave it in the lockbox with his phone and wallet. He had complied. He had also spent the first 2 hours of that evening touching his left wrist repeatedly, like a man checking for a pulse that wasn't there. Pork had lasted 3 hours. Dr. Voss had conducted it herself, standing at the front of a small briefing room, with the composed, unhurried manner of someone who had given this particular presentation many times before. She was 51 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, and eyes the color of shallow water. She spoke in measured sentences. She did not use filler words. She answered questions with the careful precision of someone who had thought very hard about exactly how much information to give. The study, she explained, was focused on sleep continuity and memory consolidation. The electrode patches they would each wear during sleep were non-invasive monitoring equipment, identical to what was used in any standard sleep clinic. The data collected would remain classified due to the study's defense funding, but each participant's personal information would be protected. The stipend would be deposited weekly. The study would last 30 days, barring any medical concerns that warranted early termination. She paused at that last part, barring any medical concerns. June Calloway, sitting in the second row with her notepad open and her pen moving, glanced up. There was something in the pause, a half beat too long, a slight recalibration in Dr. Voss's expression that she filed away without quite knowing why. She wrote the phrase down anyway, underlined it once. Dinner was served in a common room at the end of the corridor. The food was good, better than any of them had expected. Roasted chicken, seasoned vegetables, fresh bread. Harlan said it reminded him of a hotel, which he meant as a compliment. Paul Engstrom, the librarian, ate quietly at the far end of the table and did not contribute much to the conversation, though he listened carefully to everything that was said. Marcus sat across from June. He had the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting, not impatience held in check, but genuine, practiced quiet. He ate methodically. He answered questions when asked. He did not volunteer much. June asked him how he'd heard about the study. Veterans Network, he said. Email list. Did it say anything about what they were actually studying? He considered that. Sleep, he said. Said they were studying sleep. That's what they told me too. She looked down at her plate. Seems like a lot of security clearance paperwork for studying sleep. Marcus didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. Diane Cho, seated to June's left, laughed softly. She was 63, with a calm warmth that made her feel immediately familiar, like a neighbor you'd known for years without ever learning their last name. I've had sleep paralysis since I was 19, she said. 44 years of waking up, convinced something is standing at the foot of my bed. If they can tell me why, they can study whatever they like. Thomas Reyes said nothing. He sat at the head of the table, eating slowly, watching each of them in turn with a mild, pleasant expression that never quite reached his eyes. At 9:45, a soft chime sounded through the facility's intercom system. Participants, please make your way to your rooms for pre-sleep preparation. Lights will dim in 15 minutes. They filed out one by one. June paused at the doorway and looked back at the common room, the empty chairs, the cleared table, the hum of fluorescent light overhead. It was a perfectly ordinary room. There was no reason to feel what she felt standing there. She felt it anyway, like standing at the edge of something, like the moment before you step off a curb without checking for traffic. A warning from somewhere below conscious thought, arriving too late, too vague to act on. She turned off the light and went to her room. At 10 o'clock, the amber lamp dimmed and died. June lay in the dark and listened to the silence. It was a particular kind of silence, the dense, pressurized quiet of a room deep underground, where there was no traffic, no wind, no bird song, no distant sound of neighbors or television or the general ambient murmur of a world going about its business. Just the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the ventilation system and the soft red eye of the camera watching her from the corner. She closed her eyes. She thought about her dissertation. She thought about the methodology section she still needed to revise. She thought about her apartment, her cat, the stack of unread journals on her nightstand. She thought about ordinary things deliberately, the way you might hold a flashlight against the dark, and slowly, without noticing the exact moment it happened, she stopped thinking at all. She slept. Down the corridor, Marcus Hale lay on his back, with his hands folded on his chest, and stared at the ceiling for a long time before his eyes closed. He was not afraid of sleep. He never had been. What he was, if he was honest with himself, in the particular honest way that the small hours of the night sometimes demand, was cautious. The dreams had started 3 years after he came home, arriving fully formed and vivid in a way that ordinary dreams were not fragmented, not symbolic, not the nonsense collage of a resting brain cycling through the day's debris. They were structured, continuous. The same road, the same valley, the same dark tree line at the edge of the same gray sky. And the breathing. Always, at the end, the breathing. He had never told his therapist about the breathing. He had never told anyone. He had come to think of it as simply his, a private geography his mind had constructed and returned to for reasons he didn't fully understand, and had long since stopped trying to. He closed his eyes. He found the road immediately, the way you find a path you have walked 1,000 times. The valley stretched out below. The tree line stood dark and still against the sky. He walked, and behind him, very faintly, something breathed. He did not turn around. He never turned around. Tonight, for the first time, he wanted to. In the monitoring station, Doctor. Elaine Voss sat before a bank of 6 screens and watched the brainwave readouts scroll. The facility was quiet. Her assistant, Dr. Farrow, had gone to bed 2 hours ago. The overnight technician sat at a secondary console across the room, occasionally making notes, mostly watching his own screen without expression. Voss watched her readouts. 6 lines. 6 separate minds. 6 separate rhythms rising and falling in the dark. She watched for an hour. She watched for 2. She drank her coffee. She made her notes. She did not watch the clock because she had long ago learned that watching the clock while waiting for something to happen was a kind of madness. At 3:17 in the morning she saw it. Just a flicker. Just a moment. Barely a second. In which the 6 readout lines shifted, each one bending fractionally toward a common shape, before pulling apart again like magnets briefly aligned and then released. It was nothing. It was barely measurable. It was, by any objective standard, well within the parameters of statistical noise. Voss leaned forward. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she opened her log and wrote 3 words. They can hear each other. She closed the log. She sat back. She pressed her fingers together in front of her face and looked at the 6 sleeping faces on the 6 monitors and said nothing. The ventilation system hummed, the readouts scrolled, and in 6 separate rooms, in 6 separate dreams, something turned its head, slowly, all at once, and listened. Chapter 2. The Red Door. The morning debrief was held at 8 o'clock in the briefing room. They filed in one by one, still carrying the particular grogginess of waking in an unfamiliar place. That slow, disoriented reassembly of self that takes a few extra seconds when you open your eyes and don't immediately recognize the ceiling above you. Coffee had been set out on a side table. Harlan went for it immediately. Paul Engstrom sat down without taking any and folded his hands on the table and waited with the patience of a man who had spent decades surrounded by quiet. Dr. Voss stood at the front of the room with a notepad and a neutral expression. "Good morning," she said. "I'd like each of you to describe your dreams from last night in as much detail as you can recall. Don't edit. Don't dismiss anything as insignificant. Everything is relevant." She looked around the table. Who would like to begin? Diane went first. She had dreamed of her childhood home in Portland, the kitchen, specifically, with its yellow wallpaper and the window that looked out onto the backyard. An ordinary dream. Warm, even. She had been standing at the sink washing dishes when she noticed that the window showed the wrong backyard, not the one she'd grown up with, but somewhere else. Somewhere flat and gray, with a dark tree line at the edge of the frame. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Across the table, Marcus went very still. Harlan had dreamed about a hallway. He described it with the slightly embarrassed self-consciousness of someone who didn't normally talk about dreams, that social discomfort of offering up the raw, unfiltered material of your own unconscious mind to a room full of strangers. It was just a hallway, he said, long. Fluorescent lights overhead, the kind that flicker at one end. Linoleum floor. Doors on either side, all closed. He'd walked it for what felt like a long time, and at the end of the hallway there had been a door that was different from the others. Different how? Dr. Voss asked. Harlan thought about it. Red, he said. It was red. Nobody said anything. June looked down at her notepad. She had written 2 words before the debrief started, transferred from the hasty notes she'd made the moment she woke up, before the details could dissolve the way dreams always did in the first minutes of waking. Red door. She did not say anything during the debrief. She was a scientist. She understood confirmation bias. She understood that a red door was not an unusual dream image. Doors appeared constantly in dreams, and red was a common color with obvious psychological associations. The fact that Harlan had mentioned it and she had dreamed it meant nothing. Could mean nothing. 2 people in a facility with identical rooms and identical schedules and identical ambient conditions might easily produce overlapping dream imagery without any mechanism more exotic than shared environmental priming. She told herself this clearly and precisely, the way she might write a note in a methodology section. She almost believed it. What she didn't write down, what she hadn't written in her notes because writing it down would make it more real than she was prepared for it to be, was what had been on the other side of the door. She hadn't opened it. She had stood in front of it with her hand on the handle and felt something she hadn't felt since she was a child. Not fear, exactly, but the anticipation of fear. The full-body knowledge that whatever was on the other side of that door was something she could not unfeel once she had seen it. Her hand had tightened on the handle. She had started to turn it, and then she had woken up. Marcus said his dreams had been ordinary, nothing unusual. He met Dr. Voss's eyes when he said it, and she held his gaze for a moment before writing something in her notepad and moving on. He was lying, and she knew he was lying, and they both understood that nothing would be gained by pressing it. Thomas Reyes reported no significant dream activity, delivered in the flat, rehearsed tone of a man reading from a prepared statement. Paul said he had, for the first time in 6 years, dreamed at all, though he couldn't recall specifics, only a sense of color and motion and the feeling of being in a place that was very large. He said this with a quiet wonder that made Diane reach over and briefly touch his arm. Dr. Voss wrote everything down. After the debrief, she returned to the monitoring station and opened her log from the night before. They can hear each other. She stared at it for a long time. Then she opened a second file, one that was not part of the official study documentation, encrypted under a password she had chosen in 1993 and never changed, and added a new entry. Night 1. Red door imagery confirmed in 2 subjects, possible third. Synchronization progressing faster than the 1987 data suggested. Recommend continued observation without intervention. She paused. Do not tell Reyes. The second day passed in the structured rhythm that Dr. Voss had designed to feel like normalcy. Meals at regular intervals. A common room with books and a television that received only pre-approved programming. Controlled exercise periods in a small gym off the main corridor. Optional individual sessions with the facility's on-staff psychologist, Dr. Farrow, a mild-mannered man in his early 40s who asked careful questions and wrote careful notes and had, June suspected, absolutely no idea what he was actually working on. She liked him for that. It seemed like a kind of innocence. June spent the afternoon in the common room with her dissertation notes spread across the table, pretending to work. She was actually watching. Thomas Reyes sat in the corner armchair reading a novel, or holding one. She corrected herself. She hadn't once seen him turn a page. Marcus did pull-ups in the gym doorway with the methodical intensity of a man keeping himself occupied rather than someone who actually wanted to exercise. Harlan talked at length to Diane about his daughters, his ex-wife, the accounting firm where he'd worked for 16 years, the car he was thinking of buying when he got home. Diane listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that made Harlan laugh. Paul sat by himself. June noticed that he kept looking at the walls. Not in the way you looked at a wall because there was something on it, but in the way you looked at a wall because you were trying to see through it. That unfocused stare aimed at a fixed point that wasn't quite where you appeared to be looking. She'd seen that expression in sleep paralysis research. The hypervigilant scan of someone who had learned the hard way that something might be standing just outside the frame of their vision. She made a note. Paul. Perceptual disturbance? She underlined it. Then she looked at the wall herself and made herself look away. That evening, after dinner, she found Marcus in the corridor outside the common room. She had the impression he'd been waiting for her, though she couldn't have said why. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular, and when she came through the door he straightened slightly in the reflexive way of someone whose training had never quite let him be completely at ease. "The door," she said without preamble. He looked at her. "You dreamed it too." It wasn't a question. He seemed to understand that. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way he had of processing before speaking, and then he said, "What was behind it?" "I didn't open it." She paused. "You did, didn't you?" Something moved across his face, not fear, she thought, but its older, quieter cousin, recognition. The expression of a man identifying something he had already suspected. "Not last night," he said, "but I've seen the door before." He looked at the wall across from them. "I've been seeing it for 3 years." She thought about the phrase resonance compatibility and what it might actually mean, and the more she thought about it, the less like a clinical term it seemed. She closed her eyes. The hallway arrived the way familiar places do in dreams, not constructed, just suddenly present, as though it had been there all along and she had simply walked back into it. The fluorescent lights overhead, the linoleum floor, the doors on either side, all closed. At the end of the hallway, the red door. She walked toward it. She could not have said whether she was walking by choice or by something older than choice. Gravity, maybe, the pull of a thing that had decided it wanted to be seen. She stopped in front of it. She put her hand on the handle, and from the other side of the door, very clearly, someone knocked. 3 times, slow, deliberate. She did not open it, but for the first time, standing there in the architecture of a dream that she was increasingly certain was not entirely hers, she understood with absolute clarity that the knocking was not a warning. "Red?" Dr. Voss asked. He looked at her steadily. "You already know the answer to that." The room went quiet. Thomas Reyes set his coffee cup down with a small, precise click and said nothing. After the debrief, June requested a private meeting with Dr. Voss. She was given 15 minutes in a small office adjacent to the monitoring station. Dr. Voss sat behind the desk with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral, and June sat across from her and decided, in the brief moment before she spoke, that she was not going to be careful. "The electrode patches aren't standard EEG monitors," she said. Dr. Voss said nothing. "I'm writing my dissertation on neural oscillation and cross-hemisphere synchronization. I know what standard EEG data looks like, and I know what the monitoring station screens I walked past yesterday were showing, and those are not independent readouts." She held Dr. Voss's gaze. "You're linking us." A long pause. "The technology facilitates a passive synchronization of certain low-frequency brainwave patterns during deep REM sleep," Dr. Voss said finally. "It doesn't create shared experience. It creates shared frequency. The theoretical framework suggests we are sharing dreams." Another pause, shorter this time. "The data suggests a degree of environmental convergence in dream imagery that exceeds." Dr. Voss. June leaned forward. "We are sharing dreams, all of us, the same hallway, the same door, 3 nights in a row." She watched the older woman's face. "How long has this been part of the study design? And what happens when someone opens the door?" Dr. Voss was quiet for what felt like a very long time. "That," she said at last, "is what we are here to find out." June stood up. "That's not an answer." "No," Dr. Voss agreed. "It isn't." She found Marcus in the gym, not exercising, just sitting on the floor against the wall with his knees up and his forearms resting on them, looking at the middle distance. She sat down beside him without being invited, and he didn't object. She told him what she'd said to Voss. what Voss had said back. He listened without interrupting. "You opened the door," she said when she was done. "In your dreams. Before this, you said you'd seen it for 3 years. I said I'd seen the door." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't say I opened it, but you wanted to. Last night." He looked at her sideways. "You were there for that?" "The wanting to was in the air," she said. "I felt it too." He looked back at the middle distance. "It's different now," he said. "Before, it was just mine. My road, my valley, my door. Whatever was behind it was contained. Private. I could choose not to open it." He paused. "Now it feels like that's not a choice I get to make much longer. Because there are 6 of us," June said. "Because whatever is on the other side knows there are 6 of us." He said it flatly, like a tactical assessment. Not frightened, calibrating. "More channels, more signal, more..." He stopped. "More door," she said. He looked at her. "The door is bigger," she said. "I don't know how I know that, but it's bigger than it was the first night." He didn't argue with her. That evening, Paul Engstrom did not come to dinner. A staff member was sent to his room and returned to report that he was there, sitting at his desk, apparently fine. He said he wasn't hungry. He said he was writing. The notepad provided by the facility was covered in small, dense text that the staff member hadn't been close enough to read. "Doctor." Voss sent the staff member back with a direct request that Paul join the group. He came. He sat at the end of the table and ate without speaking, and June watched him the way she'd watched him the previous afternoon. That unfocused, wall-staring gaze, the hyper-vigilant peripheral scan, and noticed that it was worse, more frequent. The intervals between moments of normal social engagement were lengthening, and in those intervals his eyes went somewhere else entirely. Not blank. Occupied. The expression of someone listening to a conversation no one else could hear. After dinner, she managed to sit beside him in the common room for 20 minutes before he went back to his room. "What are you writing?" she asked. He looked at her with the gentle, slightly bewildered courtesy of someone being interrupted. "I'm not sure," he said. "It comes faster than I can get it down." He paused. "It started this afternoon, after the debrief. I sat at the desk and I just started writing. I don't know where it's coming from." "What does it say?" He seemed to genuinely consider whether to answer. "It's a description," he said finally. "Very detailed. Of a place." He looked at his hands, the same gesture Harlan had used that morning. "It's dark, mostly. There's a structure, like a building, but wrong. The geometry doesn't work right. And there are..." He stopped. "What?" "Sounds," he said. "It keeps describing sounds. I've been trying to write them down accurately, but there aren't really words." He looked up at her. "It's like something breathing," he said, "but larger than anything that breathes." June felt the hair on her arms stand up. She thought about Marcus on his road, 3 years of the same dream, always the breathing at the end, never turning around. "Paul," she said carefully, "have you been sleeping during the day? Napping?" "No." He seemed surprised by the question. "I've been awake all afternoon." She nodded slowly. "The writing," she said. "Did it start before or after you passed the monitoring station?" He frowned. "I don't. I walked past it after lunch, I think. On the way back from..." He stopped. The color went slowly out of his face. "I wasn't asleep," he said. Quietly, almost to himself. "I wasn't asleep when I walked past the station." "No," June said. "But the patches..." "Yes." He stared at her. "Even awake," he said.